Hello and welcome to a very special video, ladies and gentlemen. Before you are a selection of first focal plane LPVOs in the 1 to 8 or 1 to 10 magnification range. This is not all of the scopes that I have gotten my hands on over the last 6 years of me doing this channel, nor is it all of the optics that are available on the market in this price range. I will be talking about those later on in the video, but for right now, let's see what is on the table before us. On your left is the Primary Arms PLxC. Next to that is going to be the Eotech VUDU 1 to 10, then the NightForce NX8 1 to 8, followed by the Gen 3 Razor HD in 1 to 10, the NightForce ATACR 1 to 8, and the incredibly short March Shorty 1 to 10. That one's actually a dual focal plane reticle, but it still fits the overall motif of it being a first focal plane scope. Why am I making this video? Well, a lot of people out there have asked me to do a comparison between a lot of high-end first focal plane LPVOs. And in my opinion, I think that the 1 to 8 to 1 to 10 magnification range is about as good as it's going to get, and it makes the most sense to be in first focal plane. 1 to 6s and lower, I feel, are better suited in the second focal plane. And I wanted to do a high-end optics review. So the cheapest scope we have, or at least that's going to be brought up in this video, is the Trijicon Credo 1 to 8 in first focal plane. Obviously, that would actually come here at about $1,250, followed by the $1,500 PLxC, the Credo 1 to 10 at about $1,600, the VUDU and the Delta Stryker, which are around $1,700, which we'll be talking a lot more on those pair later, the NX8s, which start at around $1,750 and then go up from there, then the Trijicon VCOG at around $2,000, the Gen 3 Razor at $2,500, the ATACR at $2,800 plus, the March Shorty, which actually starts at $2,600, but this one as configured is around $3,000, and then the Minox ZP8 at $3,200. Yes, I do have a little cheat sheet in front of me because those are a lot of numbers to remember. I also had to figure out what order these all go in because I didn't want to have them all be disheveled. Now, a lot of the scopes that I've mentioned, I've actually reviewed previously, so I will have some footage of those. Unfortunately, it will not be directly side by side compared to the rest of these. I've had all 6 of these optics for the last 4 or so months, and it's thanks to viewers like you that made this video possible. The only optic I own on this table is the PLxC. Everything else is viewer submitted. I actually started with only 3 optics. And as I let the information go out there to my Patreon and my Subscribestar subscribers, more people started reaching out to me offering scopes for review. So thankfully, a lot of the viewers that sent in the scopes early on weren't in a rush to get the scopes back, because I've had some of these for a little bit over 4 months now, which is an extremely long time. But in that time, I have grown to appreciate all of these scopes in one way or another. It also allowed me to get a lot of time behind them in different environments and to really get to know them, which is very important for me to make a review that's going to be worthwhile for you. There's a lot to take away with every single scope that I've reviewed. And for many of you, I'm sure you're going to be wondering which one is the best. That is something that I don't believe we're going to be crowning today. I don't think there's going to be a single scope that is the best in every single way, shape, and form, at least overall. However, there's going to be a best for you, and that's the most important thing. All of these bring something different to the table, whether you realize it yet or not. Unfortunately, in my subjective opinion, all of these have some sort of flaw or another. I'll be talking about what those are very soon, but I'm going to maintain as an objective opinion as possible when we look through these scopes. I think with all that out of the way, it's time to get behind these and see how the hell I'm going to make this work.
Reticles are very personal. Like finding the best shoes for your feet, so too must you find the best reticle for you. As you will see, some of these reticles are borderline useless without the aid of illumination, while some others are completely useless altogether. To me, a well-designed reticle is one where you do not need to rely on illumination to use it at any magnification, but is also completely usable throughout the entire magnification range. Here are some examples from worst to best. Before I start talking about what is, in my opinion, the worst reticle that we're going to look at today, I will say that this is only going to be sort of a recap sort of video. The full reviews on all of these scopes are going to be coming, or they've already been made. As far as this, the EBR9 in the Gen 3 Razor HD 1-10 inverse focal plane, I am going to be resubmitting another video to see if this sample is better than the first sample that I had. Why am I making this video first as opposed to all of the individual reviews and then making this at the final sort of pièce de la résistance? It's because it'll take way too long to get this video done, and I think this video is going to do a really good job of summing these scopes up in case you are curious about which one is best for you. With that being said, the EBR9 is in my opinion the worst reticle. At 1x, it's very challenging to see, even on a plain white background. But when you start rolling in, as you'll see very soon, a more dynamic area where, things exist in the world, without the aid of illumination, it is almost impossible to see the center of this reticle. Not only that, the posts at 3, 6, and 9 are so short that they disappear even in heavy brush. Without illumination, this reticle is useless. The illumination, however, is very good, but it's something that you have to completely rely on. It is extremely bright, but unfortunately, due to its design, the center dot and that little segmented circle around it are mostly transparent, so this way they don't take up too much of the target when you are looking at something smaller at longer ranges. Sounds great in theory, but it only makes it that much harder to pick up without illumination at 1x. And even if you took it all the way up to its maximum, that center dot and that segmented circle are so large that if it wasn't transparent, you wouldn't be able to see any targets behind it. It is, again, in my opinion, the worst reticle of the bunch. It's followed very closely, however, by the S-Dog1 found in the Delta Stryker HD. This is going to be very similar to the next reticle that we're going to look at, but this one's even worse because the segmented circle, the large circle around the very fine center, is very thin and very hard to pick up. The center area is, again, very hard to pick up at 1x. However, what Delta decided to do with this reticle as opposed to Vortex or the EB9 is leave that center crosshair on the smaller side and space out those three little arrows pointing to it a little bit more, so this way you have more room around that fine center if you're focusing on a smaller target at greater distances. The Delta does have very good illumination, but this reticle really needs it to function in an environment where there are things out there in the world. Again, I'm going to use the example of being out in the brush. It really starts to come into its own like around 4 or 5x when it's a little bit easier to pick up without illumination. But here at 10x, I think it does do a good job of giving you a lot of information without being too crammed and still being able to use without illumination. The only real issue is that there's a bit of a focus issue with this scope, with getting the reticle perfect at every magnification. I really struggled getting this thing perfect, and it's something that I've experienced with a couple of other scopes in this magnification range. Next up is the SR5 found in the Eotech VUDU 1-10. Very similar to the S-Dog1, this SR5 has a fine center dot and a large donut around it. This being an Eotech product, it makes sense that they would model this on their holographic sights. It works really good on a holographic because it's really bright when you need it all the time. With this, that center dot without illumination is near on impossible to see. However, the circle around it is quite large and easy to pick up. However, at really close distances, that circle is so big that it's usually way off the target. When you do zoom in to its maximum magnification here at 10x, the center is a pretty good combination between what the EBR had and what the S-Dog1 had. I do think that this reticle is very good for precision work, even though that center dot and that little circle around it doesn't have as much information as I know some people would like. This is in 0.5 mil increments, which for me is fine, but some people like a little bit more fine than that. The illumination on this thing is very similar to the Delta, and just like with the Delta, if you jockey the magnification back and forth, the reticle, or rather the picture, shifts inside the scope. That is part of the design that these scopes have. Next up is a surprise scope. I said this video is going to be featuring only $1,000 plus scopes, but one of my good Patreon supporters and friends decided, hey, I'm going to send you an Arken EP8 to throw into the mix. And I'm actually kind of glad that he did, because it was a really great time running this thing. And very similar to both the Delta and the VUDU, this EP8 features the KL box reticle, or known limit reticle. It's very similarly styled to the VUDU reticle, so much so that if you don't know what you're looking at, you might be mistaken for one versus the other. I do think this is a little bit better for my eye to pick up over the VUDU SR5 reticle at 1x, but at this thing's maximum magnification, you might be looking for a little bit more information than this. However, for the $400 that the scope comes in at, it's a pretty decent reticle, all things considered. The illumination on it also isn't half bad either. Next up is the DMX reticle found in the NightForce NX8 and ATACR. Because both the NX8 and ATACR had the exact same reticle, I'm going to put both of them into one little segment. The DMX reticle is kind of sort of similar to the EBR9 found in the Razor, except that the posts on this are longer at 3, 6, and 9, significantly longer, about twice as long. However, I still don't know why they didn't push it all the way to the outside of the view looking through this thing. I just don't get it. However, it's much easier for my eye to get drawn to the center without illumination. With illumination, both the NX8 and the ATACR have insanely bright illumination, so much so you'd really need to be in the desert in the middle of the summer to have to use these things at maximum illumination. The only reason why I'm putting this so much farther forward from the other reticles is that at these things' maximum magnifications, the reticle is basically perfect. There is nothing to complain about with these things. They are wonderfully developed. I would love to see this reticle be put in like a 2 to 10 or a 2 to 12. I think it would be insanely nice. Next up is another option of reticles that you can get with the NX8, which are the FC in both mil and MOA. At 1x, this looks like it's easier for my eye to get drawn to the center as opposed to the DMX, where it's a little bit soft, a little bit light as far as being able to capture my eye at 1x. However, at the maximum magnification for this reticle at 8x, it's a little bit simpler than the DMX. Some people would prefer that, but it's also very easy to read and figure out. It's a very simple, nonchalant, this is what it is reticle, and I think it's a really good combination for a general purpose style rifle where you're not trying to have too much information going on to distract you. Next up are the Trijicon segmented circle reticles, which are either segmented circles or if we're talking about the VCOG, it's the crosshair dot reticle. For whatever reason, they wanted to change it up a little bit. All of these reticles do have a slight deviation from one another, but the general overall footprint is the same and the design concept is the same. You have a fairly fine crosshair in the middle, that segmented circle to help draw your eye to it, and posts at 3, 6, 9, and 12 that, again, help draw your eye to the center. We're taking a look first at the Accupower segmented circle, and you have that thick crosshair in the middle, which does pick up very well with illumination or without illumination. It does get a little bit hard to see at 1x, but around 2 to 3x, it really starts to work out well. It's nice and thick, and it works wonderfully. These are in no particular order because these reticles are so similar to one another that it's sort of just like roll the dice. But it's a good reticle at 1x, and it's a good reticle at 8x. I think it's a really good balance of everything, but I still would like to see some changes made. Again, primarily with the posts being fully extended to the outside of the image, and maybe that center crosshair being not larger, but a little bit more prominent at 1x. Overall, though, I think this is a very well set up reticle, and something that I do think could be far worse. Next up is the MR10 Plus reticle found in the Minox. The only reason why I'm not putting this any higher is from what I've seen as far as pictures and other videos, that center crosshair does look a little bit more on the finer side. However, the posts at 3, 6, and 9 are tapered and go almost the full view through the scope, which is at least a huge plus in my opinion. at maximum magnification as seen here. I do think that those steps are a little bit on the weaker side. I would like to see a little bit more gradation in there, so this way you have a little bit more fine aiming point. But I think that this is a very good reticle overall, and I would imagine that the illumination on this would be brighter than what the next reticle is going to be. Next up is the M8 mil reticle. You could also get this set up for 556/308 from Primary Arms, and I think this is one of the better reticles out there because you do not need illumination to use this thing effectively at any magnification. A lot of people, myself included, complained that the first focal plane PLxC had very dim illumination. When you're spending roughly $1,500 on an LPVO, you kind of want the illumination to be at least daytime bright, not like super red dot holographics bright, but brighter than what this thing offers. However, because this reticle is so well designed and developed, you do not need illumination to use it in almost any sort of environment. The outside posts at 3, 6, 9, and 12 are stepped down from thick to thinner going towards the center, and it automatically draws your eye right to the middle. At the middle, we have a large chevron. Some people love chevrons, some people hate chevrons. I don't mind chevrons, but I think I do prefer like a one MOA dot in the center. But the semicircle around that chevron is a wonderful size and scale. This being the mil reticle, you have drops for your windage and elevation at half mil increments, which is wonderful. However, if you choose the 556 or 308 reticle, you have wind hold and drop distances for certain cartridge weights and whatnot. And finally, what I feel is the best overall reticle is, hold on, let me get this right, the DR-TR1FB, found in the March Shorty 1-10 Gen 2. This dual focal plane reticle has a lot going on. At 1x, you have a very simple crosshair style reticle. It's very effective, efficient, and easy to pick up, but increasing the magnification all the way, you can see that you have a plethora of information that is just extracted into your face. I'm talking only about the reticles, not about the image or anything else right now. This reticle is simply sublime. The illumination is a fine center dot that does not change size. It does get decently bright, but it does lag behind the top performers as far as illumination brightness goes. But the reticle design and dual focal plane setup of this scope really is something that needs to be appreciated. I think it works extremely well. However, I do think that in the body that the March Shorty is in, what it occupies, I do think it falls short by a fair margin. And we're going to talk about that very soon. But this reticle overall is the best designed reticle, bar none. Because at least one person out there is going to ask how the illuminations stack up against one another, I devised this very comprehensive list to explain it a little bit easier. Tied for first place, we have the Gen 3 Razor HD and both NightForce options. These are so close as far as brightness to one another that it's going to be hard to pick out which one's the ultimate brightest. As far as deviation between maximum to minimum, some of them perform a little bit better than others, but as far as raw overall brightness goes, those three are basically tied for first. Below that, we have what I feel comes in second place, which is a lot of the optics that we're going to be looking at today. These are in no particular order, but all of those are basically in the same sort of category as far as illumination capacity. Last place is going to be the PLxC. It is the weakest by far, and it's unfortunate because I know a lot of people are going to write that optic off because they want brighter illumination, and I can't blame them. Tied for last place are two knowns and a guess. They are going to be the VUDU, the Stryker, and the Credo 1-10. The reason for this is not that they have the worst eye box, but they have a meh eye box and really bad image stability. On paper, all three of these scopes are very, very similar. They're all priced almost exactly the same. The length on them are also almost exactly the same. Guess what? The weight? They're all 21 ounces. They're also all made in Japan, probably in the exact same factory, even more so specific, maybe even on the exact same line. The only differences between them are a very minor difference to the field of view. The VUDU is about a 116.6 at 1x. However, the Credo 1 to 10, guess what? 116.6 feet at 100 yards. And the Stryker says about a 125, give or take. So a little bit of changes there, but that could just be variances on the specifications for each individual company. The thing that grinds my gears is that all three of these are 1 to 10s. And if they were 1 to 8s, I know that they'd possibly perform better because guess what? The other two Trijicon 1 to 8s that we're going to look at are nowhere near as bad as these. Again, my speculation on the Credo 1 to 10 is only because it really fits these criteria very close to both the VUDU and the Stryker. But the worst thing isn't necessarily the eye box. The eye box at 1x is okay. It's definitely on the tighter side, but when you get closer to 8 and 10x, it definitely gets tight. But the biggest thing I have with the Stryker and the VUDU is the image stability. At 1x, it's okay. But from anything north of 1x to about 4 or 5x, it completely falls apart. Beyond that, it does get better, but the intermediate magnifications really, really suck. For many of you, that might not even be a concern. You might only go from 1x to 8x. But for me, I really like to run 1.5 to 2x sometimes. And that's the main reason why these are all in dead last. Next up is actually going to be a bit of a surprise. It's the March Shorty 1 to 10. Again, not because the eye box is really, really tight, but because it's kind of tight, and the higher up in the magnification you go, everything falls apart rather quickly. There's a lot going on with this scope. It is extremely small. It is very light. It's very short. It's got a very small exit pupil, and as a result of all of these parts coming together, the eye box suffers greatly. With an exit pupil of 8.6 millimeter at the biggest and 2.4 at the smallest, not only is that very small, but the image degrades, I feel, very quickly. At 1x, it's not terrible, but the higher up in the magnification you go, the worse it gets. The only nice thing about this is that because it has a dual focal plane reticle, the illumination is visible at any magnification, no matter how off the eye box you are, which is at least a good thing. Unfortunately, the rest of it just falls pretty flat. Like I've said with the PLxC, the C stands for compromised. Whenever you make something small, lightweight, and compact, quote, air quotes going on, there's going to be something that it's given up. And for this thing, being as small and as light as it is, it's the eye box. With that being said, you could guess what the next one is going to be, the PLxC. The eye box on this is always something that I had a very challenging time with. Even though the exit pupil is technically a little bit worse than what the March is, the 1x on this is just flat out beautiful. The view through it is very large, very small border around it. It's very flat, and that's the only reason why it's getting a little bit more of a bump. Up to 6x, it's really not terrible, but it is very tight, especially when you start factoring in how this performs against some of the other ones we're going to be looking at very soon. The biggest problem with the PLxC is above 7x, where the eye box becomes almost unusable, even in super bright conditions. The only reason why this probably isn't in last place is because the reticle really is easy to pick up at any magnification. That's something to factor in. And it also has very good image stability up until about 6 or 7x. The March, I felt, really started to taper off quickly above like 6, where this at least holds itself on to about 6. And again, being a 1 to 8 versus a 1 to 10, it edges out the March Shorty, but ever so slightly. Next up is the EP8. I think that this is a slightly better version of the VUDU for a lot less money, even though it's Chinese made. Reticle, they're almost the same. View through them, they're almost the same. There's a lot of similarities between this and the VUDU, and subsequently the other two optics that we just talked about. But this being a 1 to 8, it really does allow it to work a little bit better as an overall cohesive package. I'm happy that Arken didn't go for the 1 to 10 in this because it would only be worse than what this currently is. If this had a little bit better glass, a little bit better construction, it would probably perform much better, but then it would also cost a lot more than what this thing comes in at around the $400-ish price point. All in all, this is completely middle of the road, and as a result, it's really not that bad. The NX8 is a bit of a surprise. Not only is it very small and very light, very similar with both the March Shorty 1 to 10 and the PLxC, but it's also very small with the exit pupil. A maximum of 7.9 millimeter at 1x is not very large. In fact, it's smaller than a lot of the other competition that we have here. However, because the view through it is so small and not blown out to be super large, it actually doesn't have a terrible eye box as a result. They struck a fine balance. It might be a small exit pupil, but that exit pupil maintains its size a little bit longer. As a result, the experience behind this isn't bad from an eye box perspective. However, a lot of the rest of the experience behind this thing falls a little bit flat in my opinion. Despite the fact that the eye box on this thing is more forgiving than what's found in the PLxC, to do a side-by-side comparison real quick, to at least talk about it, I'd still prefer the PLxC, despite the fact that this has a more forgiving 1x. It just doesn't excite me as much as what the PLxC does at 1x, or 2x, or 4x, or even at 6x. The only area where the NX8 really shines over the PLxC is going to be at 8x, but that's no surprise there. The Gen 3 Razor HD is the highest performing 1 to 10 eye box test that we have. There's a lot of good things going on with the Razor. This example is much better than the first one that I got my hands on, and as a result, using this isn't terrible. Optically, this thing is very impressive. I think it falls short a lot on some of the fine tuning. Reticle is like 99.9% of it. But the eye box behind this thing is much better than the other 1 to 10s, at least from my experience and my findings. The very slim profile of the body really is a signature Razor trait, and it really it comes together as a beautiful package. I should have specified earlier, I'd be okay with a slightly tighter eye box at the higher magnifications, because you're only going to really be using a really high magnification on any of these optics. If you're in a position and requirement where you need that magnification, I much more am concerned about the 1x eye box and the intermediate magnification, so up to about 4 or 5x. The Razor performs extremely well even up to 10x, and optically there's nothing that I could really fault with this particular model. Next up is another educated guess, so please enjoy a picture of a kitty cat. This is going to be for the Minox ZP8. On paper, the specs show that it does have a little bit of an edge over the Gen 3 Razor. It's actually 1.5 inches longer than the Razor, which typically when I find an optic is longer, it performs better with the eye box. Kind of like, think of it more like more your sight radius on a long rifle versus a short rifle. The longer the sight radius, the easier it is for you to line up and get behind it. The field of view is also a little bit smaller than what we find with the Razor, but the exit pupil is a little bit larger. So factoring all these things together, I feel that the ZP8 would come out on top over the Gen 3 Razor. The top three are very close to being similar, but if I had to put them in 1, 2, and 3, third place would go to the NightForce ATACR. This is a very impressive eye box scope. Every time I got behind it, I would always say the same thing. Wow, it's really easy to get behind this thing. Even though the DMX reticle might not be the best to draw your eye to the center, I am specifically talking solely about its ability to be looked through. And in that case, the ATACR really is something to admire. It does have a lot going for it. It only has 96.1 foot of field of view at 100 yards at 1x, but the exit pupil, 11.3 millimeter at 1x. That is huge. To put that into comparison, the Gen 3 Razor HD is only 10 millimeter. So you're talking about 1.3 millimeter more. That's 13% more. That's big. That's nice. But comparing this specifically to the Gen 3 Razor HD, they're basically the exact same weight at 21 ounces, but they're also the exact same length at 10.1 inches. So it really comes down to the ATACR having a larger exit pupil, a smaller field of view, and a little bit longer eye relief, 3.7 versus 3.6 inches. All of those things come into, oh, we can't forget about the magnification, a 1 to 10 versus a 1 to 8. So the glass in the 1 to 8 is going to be working less than the glass in the 1 to 10. All of these things come together to make the ATACR basically tied for first place. And tied for first place, it is a win for Trijicon. Both the Accupower, the Credo, and the VCOG. No matter which one you get, you're going to be getting an amazing 1X experience. And the reason for that is very simple. If we look on paper, the length of these scopes are about 3/4 of an inch larger than the ATACR or the Gen 3 Razor. The field of view is actually split right down the middle between those two. It's 105.8 and 109 feet for the Credo and VCOG, respectively. But the biggest difference is the exit pupil. 11.7 to 11.8 millimeter. Factor that against the 11.3 for the ATACR, and you can see that, again, we're at 6-ish% larger. It's going to make a big difference. We also have a little bit more eye relief. The Credo claims about 3 to 4 inches, where the VCOG claims right at 4 inches. All of these things culminate together to give you perhaps the best eye box that I could think of for a first focal plane LPVO. I have narrowly escaped spending money on a Credo 1 to 8 first focal plane for months, actually years. Since I reviewed the Accupower many moons ago and the VCOG only about a year or so ago, I have the itch to get one of them. Not because I really have a particular need for them yet. I think for an AR10 build it would be flawlessly perfect. But the other variables that really come into consideration are the reticle, which are pretty good, but they could be a little bit better, and the weight. The Credo is 25% heavier than almost everything else we've looked at the minimum, and the VCOG, without a mount, they're 31.5 ounces. But you don't buy these because you want a lightweight scope. You buy these because you want things that feel really robust in hand, especially that VCOG. I'm pretty sure you could throw it off an aircraft carrier and it would be fine, or even shoot it backwards like that Commander did. And, I mean, yeah, the track record for these things speak for themselves. Very similarly to the Illumination segment, I'm going to just give you a very quick rundown with a list. At the top, the best is the March Shorty 1 to 10. Not only does it have the most features of any of these scopes by a long shot, it also has some of the best feeling controls of all of these scopes by a long shot. The rest of it is actually pretty hard to pick out. Mostly, this is going to come down to personal preference and what you are looking for. But for second place, I have the Delta Stryker HD 1 to 10. The reason being, even though it's not great optically in my opinion, and the reticle is definitely lacking, the fact it has a side parallax and really good controls otherwise are reasons why it's number 2. Tied for third place are 2 Trijicons and the Eotech. The VCOG, well, because it's the VCOG and has a lot of interesting things going on, like an included mount, the ability to take AA batteries, and, well, that really giant grab handle on the magnification ring. The reason why the Credo and the VUDU are so high up as well, locking elevation turrets. If you want to dial, you have the ability to do so. The VUDU is the exact same turret as the Stryker, but you know what? For a very low profile, slim line elevation turret that locks, it's really something special, despite the fact it doesn't have zero stop. Mixed tied for fourth place is going to be the Razor, the PLxC, both NightForces, and my guess is going to be the ZP8. I'll start with the ZP8 first because I have really nothing to say on that. My experience with the ZP5 was that it had very good controls, and for the price, it should be pretty good, so that's where that is. As far as the NX8 and the ATACR, how could a scope that's twice the price be better than the NX8? Well, I actually prefer some of the controls on the NX8, but the ATACR overall feels really solid. Not saying that the NX8 doesn't, but I like the fact that when you change the magnification ring on the NX8, the entire ocular eyepiece doesn't rotate. Some people will prefer that, some people won't. But I also prefer the turrets on the NX8 because they have a little bit better sound and feel as opposed to what the ATACR is. That's the only reason why these two are on the same plane. As far as the PLxC, the reason why that is so high is, again, because this has the ability to have capped turrets, both windage and elevation, or you can have an exposed elevation turret, albeit a non-locking one. And the Razor is where it is because it has the lockable illumination control, which I really am a sucker for, but it also doesn't have a built-in cattail or throw lever, so that could be a pro or con depending on who you are. Tied for last is going to be the EP8 and the Credo 1 to 10 as being a guess. We'll start with the EP8. Even though the controls on this thing are actually very good, it feels very cheap. Again, because it's a $400-ish optic at the most expensive it'll ever be. As far as the Credo 1 to 10, why is that so low? Or at least why I would put it so low? Large, unlockable target turrets on an LPVO. Say what you want, that just does not make sense to me. For this segment, we are going to start with the cheapest and work our way up to the most expensive. I'm not going to do a best to worst because we've already touched on a lot of the reasons why these would be good or bad. Instead, I want to actually start showing you some stuff. The first thing you're going to notice with the EP8 is that when you have the illumination a little bit too bright, you start getting some very odd looking reflections inside. Again, for $400 LPVO, what can you expect? However, turning it down slightly with the brightness, it really fixes that problem. The reticle on this is almost the exact same size as what we see with the Eotech, but I think I prefer it in the EP8 over the VUDU. I don't know why, really, other than the center dot is a little bit easier for my eye to pick up with or without illumination. The 1X on this thing is quite forgiving, and the 8X, as you saw right there, is wonderful when you get behind it in a good stable position. There was no real loss of brightness that I saw to my eye, and I genuinely enjoyed it. The only issue I really had with this optic overall was I had a very challenging time setting the rear diopter to get the reticle focused perfect to my eye and to my camera. However, with a lot of tweaking, I was able to find the sweet spot between 1X and 8X. I would notice that there was a shift to the sharpness of the image and the reticle, and it just took me a long time to really get that sorted out. However, its 1X performance in an environment like this is really quite good. Next on the price list is the Trijicon Accupower or Credo, first focal plane, obviously, 1 to 8. A lot of things have changed since I reviewed this scope, mainly just how I set myself up and position myself from one area to the next, but you're going to get the general idea while watching this. The illumination on this, at least for the red version, is more than acceptable for these conditions. The reticle itself, I would like to see tweaked, but we've already talked about that. As far as how this thing performs at 1X, you can see even very close objects, we are almost flawless when it comes to distortion, shift, and magnification. It's even better when you increase the magnification all the way to its maximum. I vividly remember reviewing the scope and not wanting to send it back. It was that impressive. There's so many things that are going on with it that I like, and only a few things that I don't like. The weight is one of them, and the reticle is another, but I think I could justify both of those given just how good this thing is overall. I'm being very serious, folks, when I say that this thing isn't just one of the best 1X performance on a first focal plane LPVO. It's one of the best performances on any LPVO. It's really impressive. And down here in these environments, you have such a large eye box and view through it, and the illumination's good. It's such a wonderful experience to get behind one of these things. Despite the fact that it's the second cheapest one that we're looking at here, it really doesn't act like it in these conditions. Continuing down the list, next up is the Primary Arms PLxC. There is a lot to talk about with this thing's 1X. Primarily how good it is. The view through this thing and the profile of the scope body that we see mixed in with the reticle and the illumination in these environments. I'm going to say these environments because this is a much darker area than out in the middle of a desert in the middle of the day. But down here, it's really hard to fault. I cannot stress this enough. The 1X performance on this thing is near on perfect. It's not as good as the Accupower or Credo 1X as far as flatness and distortion goes, but it is so close. It's better than most second focal plane LPVOs. The biggest thing is here. Even with a perfect setup behind it, you can see there's a little bit of darkening to the image and to the outside edge. That's the only issue with this optic overall, in my opinion, is just the tight eye box and darkening to the image and loss of some sharpness and clarity at 7 and 8x. But below that, it is so painfully effective. Despite the fact that the illumination could and maybe even should be brighter, everything else is just absolutely wonderful when you get behind one of these things and actually run it. Again, I don't have any footage for the Credo 1 to 10, so here's another picture of my cat. Next up is the Eotech VUDU, and this thing is, well, wait, hold on. Is this the VUDU or is this the Arken again? I'm sorry. Yeah, this is the Arken EP8 again. Hold on. All right, there we go. Fixed. Now we're talking about the Eotech VUDU, which looks almost exactly the same. However, there are better coatings on the lenses, and as a result, the illumination doesn't have that weird sort of refractory looking thing. 1X on this is not terrible, considering it's a 1 to 10. It's pretty good. This, the Delta, and the Razor all perform very close to one another. However, the Razor has better stability in the in-between magnifications, and this and the Delta sort of fall a little bit flat. For anyone wondering, to get past that large ring, you're about 6x. So zoom in to about 6x and you won't see it anymore. I do feel that these reticles could strongly be changed. I think the donut is way too big. I think if Eotech was really smart, they would have made it the exact same size 65 MOA circle that's found on the EXPSs, for example, and then made some big posts at 3, 6, and 9 to draw your eye to the center. I feel that this big donut is just a little bit too large. Another thing I feel is, without illumination, it is useless in any environment other than a picture-perfect, bright, sunny day on a square range. The reticle is, I think, this thing's biggest weak point. Following suit with weak reticles is going to be the Delta Stryker HD. This thing's reticle is worse than the Eotech's because the border around it is that much smaller. The center dot, or crosshair arrow thingamabob, is a little bit easier to pick up, but only just. Another thing that the Delta does is get a little bit too bright with the illumination, which you would think isn't that big of a deal. You just bring it down, and yes, you could use it here, and it's more or less pretty fine. However, even when you bring it up to a brighter environment and you increase the illumination, you will start to see some hazing or red glare coming back from the illumination on the glass. Beyond that, both this and the VUDU perform almost exactly the same. This is one of the reasons why I don't think that having an adjustable parallax on an LPVO is a good idea. Because unless you're planning on using it at more or less extended ranges and then bringing it down for closer ranges secondary, having an adjustable parallax means that if it gets bumped out or you have it in the wrong setting, now all of a sudden you might zoom in and have a very blurry image as opposed to a maybe slightly blurry image. The concept between an LPVO with and without side parallax really does change the whole thing's dynamic. Just because it has it doesn't necessarily mean it's better. And this Delta Stryker is perfect case in point. Beyond that, there isn't really a whole lot else to say other than I think it could really use some vast improvements. The NightForce NX8 is another small, lightweight, compact 1:8. Very similar to the PLxC. But as you're about to see, it handles itself completely different from how the PLxC handles itself. First off, the illumination gets ridiculously bright. But look at the view looking through this thing. Look at the amount of scope body that we see. There actually is a large amount of distortion by comparison to the PLxC when you look through the NX8. And the DMX reticle, at least, kind of sort of works without illumination, but nowhere near as good as the mill reticle found in the PLxC. But if you're a big fan of good illumination, well, the NX8 will have that in spades. Unfortunately, again, this is of my personal opinion, relying on illumination to have a good reticle, like we've seen with a couple of other scopes, is not great, because if it fails, we have a problem with it, and you really want to use it in 1X environment, you're going to have a bit of an issue with it, especially if you're in a complicated area and it's not super bright out. The small view through this, mixed in with a little bit of distortion and a narrow field of view, makes using this rather unpleasant. I like a big, large view. No surprise there. I don't know of many people that don't. But if you really don't like a small view, then the NX8 is going to be a very bad option for you. It is by far and away the smallest view look through it and the narrowest field of view throughout the entire magnification range of any of these optics. The Trijicon VCOG, very similar to the Accupower and Credo as far as overall setup goes, does have some very minor differences. The reticle is slightly different, but only on like the center crosshair and that center area. As far as what the 1:10 version of the Credo has, it's actually a Christmas tree style reticle, so it's even more different, but that's only available with the 1:10, and well, that's really it. Very similar with the Accupower. The 1X performance on this is exceptionally good, as is the 8X. The large magnification ring is one of my favorite things about this optic. You can grab it even in the worst possible scenario and it will just be right, it falls right in hand. It's excellent. As far as everything else with this, it's basically the exact same as I had experienced with the Accupower, and it's pretty freaking awesome. Another surprise with this optic is you will get a great workout with your forearms, your biceps, your shoulders, just by this thing's added weight being on your rifle. So, it's a win-win all around.
Gen 3 Razor.
If I already complained about the EBR9 reticle found in the Gen 3 Razor HD, let me continue to do so. Yes, the illumination is one of the brightest ones here, and I think I prefer the size of it when it's fully on as opposed to what's found in the DMX reticle. But the illumination off this reticle is just, it's almost impossible to see. I actually think I prefer the reticles found in both the EP8, the VUDU, the Delta over the EBR9 found in the Razor. Of course, that is my personal opinion. You might love this thing, but I do feel that it is an extremely compromised reticle given the rest of the field out there. Reticle aside, we have a pretty typical Razor performance in a couple of other areas. The reticle brightness, for one, the view looking through it, and the profile of the scope body, all of which are excellent. At this thing's maximum magnification, talking one more time about the reticle without illumination, it is hard to pick up at the center. I know why they did it, so this way it doesn't obscure too many targets behind it, but at least make that center dot, you know, full dark, not slightly opaque. The 1X does have a bit of an image shift. It does have some distortion and maybe even a touch of magnification. Overall, for a 1:10, it's not bad, but I think I might actually give it to the VUDU a little bit more as far as a 1:10 at 1X being a better overall performance, but no one can argue what the Razor brings to the table. Because the DMX reticle is found in both the NX8 and the ATACR, in this instance, we're going to go straight to the illumination being on with the ATACR. Illumination on both of these are fantastic, but very similar with what we saw with the NX8, the view looking through the ATACR is a little bit on the smaller side, and the scope profile is monstrous. However, it also has a monstrous eye box, which is, a bit of a give and take. The big eye box really is awesome to get behind this thing and use it in any sort of environment at any magnification. The 1x performance on this is also pretty good, but there is more distortion, a little bit of fisheye than I was expecting. Given how small the view looking through this is compared to, I'll bring it up again, the PLxC or even the Accupower. I was expecting a flatter, cleaner 1x, but this thing just doesn't seem to have it. The March Shorty 1 to 10 actually performs pretty damn good at 1x. It's got a similar sized view looking through it as opposed to the ATACR, but a much smaller profile to the scope body, which I prefer. The dual focal plane reticle is also extremely good, on par with what we see with the PLxC. The owner of this scope actually had an ATACR before, but she prefers this, and I'm pretty confident that the biggest reason is going to be just how nice the reticle is, and how much less of the scope body we have. At 10x down here, you will see that the image is going to get dark, and trust me, if we had to move this camera or your eye behind it a little bit, those shadows creep up so damn fast. But the 1x performance on this thing is quite good. There's very little to no shift between looking through the scope and what we see outside with the bare naked eye. The illumination is fantastic, the reticle is fantastic, and there's very low distortion. It's a very good performing 1x and something that I very much enjoyed. Meow. Meow. For this, I'm going to start off with the scopes that I have the least amount of information for, and then work my way forward. Of course, I'm not even going to bother talking about the ZP8 or the Credo 1 to 10, because I have no information. I'm going to start with the Trijicon VCOG 1 to 8. And when I filmed this, I was stupid and forgot to make sure that the eye relief was set properly. So the scope is actually mounted a little bit farther forward from where perfect eye relief is. As a result, the image is going to be slightly skewed. The center is still pretty damn sharp. In fact, everything inside that circle is pretty damn sharp, but on the outside of that, you will see that it softens up and we get a little bit of chromatic aberration at the far extremes. The red illumination on this is quite nice, and the center crosshair is quite fine if you are concerned about having a very precise aiming point, at least on the center. We'll take a look at the Accupower momentarily, but you'll see that that has a thick crosshair in the middle as opposed to this, which has that very fine center dot and that little 4 crosshair right around it. I can see why Eotech and Arken and Delta decided to run a larger center circle than what you see here with the segmented circle on this 1 to 8, and that's because, well, the segmented circle is very visible and it can obscure a lot of your targets downrange. So it is a give and a take. However, I don't mind this that much because if I'm going to be taking a long, precise shot, I'm not going to be as concerned. I'd rather the lower magnification be easier to pick up than the higher magnification. And it's not like it's completely enclosed around the center section like what we see with the EBR9 in the Razor. The rest of the performance on this scope suffers because of the weather conditions. The lighting was pretty bad, very cloudy and overcast, and the fact that it was pushed too far forward on the rail. Nevertheless, it's still a pretty usable image, and considering that we're at 8x and we can still see the center of the image being as sharp as it is and as much of the view looking through the scope as well as we do, it's a testament to this thing's very large eye box. Even here at 300 yards, despite the fact it's only an 8x, we can make out a lot of information on these targets in poor lighting conditions. So overall, this thing, despite again being set up wrong by me, because I'm a fool, the VCOG still performs pretty damn good. To get a better understanding of how the VCOG would look, next we're going to look at the Accupower, considering that these things do share a lot of DNA. First though, we're going to take a real quick look at this thing's 1x as we pan across this sound barrier. It's so good. There is no shift when you look through the scope as opposed to outside, or if it's there, it's so minimal. A lot of times some scopes really suffer with that, but the Accupower and VCOG are not ones. The weather conditions when I filmed with this were fairly similar to the VCOG, very overcast and cloudy, but here you can see that the image doesn't really suffer all that much. Again, a lot has changed in the last few years when I reviewed both this and the VCOG. The camera's changed, my setup has changed, and my luck with lighting has changed. You'll notice that very soon. Image here at 180 yards on that berm is, well, hard to fault, really. There's plenty of contrast to pick up rocks and pieces of steel on brown dirt, and you can see that the center of the reticle on this is a little bit thicker crosshair than what we find on the VCOG. I actually prefer this thicker crosshair as opposed to what the VCOG has because it's easier to pick up at lower magnifications. The dying long grass behind the 200-yard targets is another great example that you can still make out a lot of contrast despite the pretty poor lighting conditions. And that steel target off to the right, you can see a lot of information on that thing with this thing. And it's not like the farther out you go, the worse it gets. This might only be 325 or so yards to the steel plates, but the image here is quite sensational. I really do think that the farther out you push these, the better they get. And that is why, despite the fact that these might be a little bit on the cheaper side, optically, I think they're some of the best performing 1:8s or 1:10s in the first focal plane on the market today. Last up of the old guard is going to be the Delta Stryker HD. Again, a very overcast, cloudy winter day. My luck just sometimes sucks, what can I say? Look at how hard it is to pick up that reticle, even with illumination on full. It's so friggin' hard. I don't know why anyone would think that this reticle is great or the best thing out there. It's mediocre at best. Slowly increasing the magnification though, and you can see that it really starts to come into its own, especially when we get to about the 8x or 10x magnification range, as right there. Cropping the image, you'll see that it really does provide a very good aiming source at the middle, and I like the information that they give. It's enough without being too much. You have great holdovers for both elevation and windage. The center crosshair is pretty fine, which allows for a very precise aiming point, and those arrows at 3, 9, and 12 are a good way of drawing your eye to the center without cluttering up the center, unlike what we will soon see on the EBR9. The only issue is, optically, it's not, oh my god, amazing. The side parallax, as you just saw, does allow the fine-tuning of the image to be pretty good, but it just never seems to be as sharp, capable as it should be. I found that I always hunted with the parallax on that scope a lot to try to get the most out of it. It never seemed like it was very easy or intuitive just to turn it and know exactly where the best spot was. I always felt like it could be a little bit better. And sometimes I'd go past where I needed to be and then go back, and then you go back and forth. Again, one of the reasons why maybe not having a side parallax on an LPVO like this is a good thing. Pushing that to 200 yards, and we can get a pretty good looking image on the center, but again, I find myself fiddling around with the side parallax, spending way too much time trying to get the image to look perfect. And even then, the center looks pretty good, but the outside, it's a little bit softer. I think that the Accupower and the VCOG performed this role better. Yes, those were 1:8s. This is a 1:10. But if this thing was a better developed 1:8, it would perform, guess what? Probably significantly better than how this performs. Moving back to 300 yards, and you will see more of the same. We can get the image to look good, but it's never like, wow, that's really good. It's just mediocre. And I find that it's a big time waster constantly shuffling around that side parallax to try to fix an issue that is inherent to just having too big of a magnifier. However, there are some versions of 1:10s that perform better, and we're going to be taking a look at those right now. We're actually going to look at the Delta's cousin, the VUDU 1-10 first. And the whole reason why I'm doing this is just to showcase that the reticle not only is a little bit better, but not having an adjustable side parallax isn't the end of the world on a 1-10 when it is properly set up. I might not be in love with the VUDU, but I certainly don't absolutely hate it. One thing it does well is maintain a very good level of sharpness, despite the magnification and despite the distance beyond 100 yards. I say that because if you crank this thing up to 10x and look at a target that's 25 yards away, of course it's going to be blurry. But from 100 yards as seen here and beyond, you will see that it performs its duties very well. And its main duty is have everything be in focus. The reticle at 10x I think is very nice. The center dot is a good size, easy to pick up. The donut is not too big where you don't really have a use for it, but not so small that it's obtrusive. And the windage and elevation holds are a nice touch. At this 180-yard berm, there isn't a whole lot more that I could ask for from this image. The center is very sharp. The outside edge is a little bit soft, but backing out the magnification to 8x doesn't really make that much of a difference, which, depending on how you see it, is a good thing, meaning that the 10x performs actually much better than you think it might. Backing it out even further to 6x yields an even more impressive image, but the reticle is not really in its stride. When we push it out to 300 yards, at 6x again, the image still looks very, very good. But the one nice thing is, as we increase the magnification to its maximum, the image doesn't seem to be as soft on the edge as we saw at 180-ish yards. So the farther out we go, the better it looks. And under that thick canopy, those targets are pretty sharp and clear. The Illumination also does an exceptionally good job at maintaining a very high tolerance to the reticle itself and not bleeding out. But let's go even further than this. We're now going to shift our attention to some very long distance targets, or at least that's what I think. The first solar panel we're going to look at is around 300 yards, then 600, then about 900, and then we'll look off as far as we can into the horizon. The Illumination is doing a thing, because when I filmed it was so bright out there that the emitter just so happened to sync up with my shutter speed, and it just blinked like that. It's not a phenomenon that doesn't happen all the time, but it's also something that never exists. So I shut it off so we could focus solely on this thing's optical performance. At maximum magnification at about 300-ish yards, we have a pretty good looking image, but it does look a little bit soft. There was a slight haze to the air when I filmed this day because it was the middle of August and it was the best that I got. But at the 300-ish yard target here, it looks pretty good. At the 600 and 900-ish yard targets, though, it looks almost exactly the same, except there is a lot more mirage in the air because it was like 100 degrees out. So there you have it. Optically, this thing performs very good in my opinion, all things considered, and I think it's better than what the Delta Stryker HD is capable of, even though that has a side parallax. This is just a showcase that sometimes less is more. The last thing to showcase is just how tight this thing is with the eye box at 10x. It is very, very tight, but at least the reticle and the image kind of stay sharp to one another, but it's not for very long. So the VUDU worked better than the Delta did, but let's see if the March, that costs twice the price of those optics, can perform even better being twice the price and having a side parallax. Well, there's only one way to find out. The illumination on this thing on a very bright sunny day is adequate. It's not red dot bright, it's good enough. But again, having a very well-designed reticle that's usable at every magnification doesn't necessarily need to have super bright illumination. However, it's really nice to have it, and this scope doesn't really have it. This is as bright as the illumination got, and it was a little bit disappointing. But that wasn't the only thing that was a little disappointing. The image sharpness just never seems to really captivate me or wow me. Even at 100 yards here at 10x, it just seems to be a little flat. Pushing it out a little bit further to 180 yards, and the image does look a little bit better. But look at the reticle, it just falls apart. I try to fine-tune the side parallax to get a little bit better, and I think we've sort of landed exactly where we were. I don't know if there's an optical issue with this, but very similar to the 3-24 March that I reviewed a while ago, it left me completely, I was just not impressed by the overall optical performance of it. Physically, it is a wonderment. It is incredible. But optically, not so much. Pulling out the magnification to around 8x, it does improve the image even further, but only just a little bit. At 300 yards under a heavy canopy, these targets at least look pretty decent. The center of the image does get a very high level of sharpness, but I feel like it does soften up a little bit more on the outside edge. The reticle being, again, something that I must highlight because that's as good as I was able to get it. You could get the outside of the reticle to look sharper, but then the inside suffers. Sure, to the naked eye, you can balance that a little bit easier, but on camera, it was very, very hard to get everything to look better than this. It was still slightly disappointing, but I do think that out here, the image looks better than what we saw earlier. Coming back out to the power lines, we're going to start with the 300-yard target and move our way back. With the illumination on full, you can see that it's still, well, quite lackluster. The image, though, at 300 yards here matches what we saw under the thick canopy at the large bore range, and it looks pretty damn good. At the maximum magnification, the reticle really does offer a ton of information, but again, it's just not super, super sharp. Side parallax, I found that when I left it at a particular setting, where 300 yards was, everything beyond that was pretty much exactly where it needed to be focus-wise. So having a side parallax, it's more of a detriment than anything else. And it's even more so on the march because the way the illumination knob works in conjunction with the parallax knob, you turn on the illumination with a push button, but then you adjust the brightness with an outside rheostat, and it's just tight enough that when you go to adjust the rheostat, it also adjusts the side parallax a little bit. And it's really, really infuriating. Oh God, it's so infuriating. I just don't know why they did it. I don't get it, folks. This is the only thing that a side parallax is good for on a 1 to 10, looking at the flowers. Beyond that, I think just design a better optic, take the side parallax, and throw it out the window. The best thing about this scope, though, is the dual focal plane reticle, because when you shift slightly off center, you could at least still see the illumination. Now, the image stability on this, the reticle sharpness and the image sharpness is very, very high, but that eye box is very tight. Look at how fast those shadows creep up on the left and the right, just shifting ever so slightly. Even at 8x, it is very abrupt. Those shadows creep in so fast that they will catch you off guard if you're in anything other than a perfect position. Let's take a look at the final 1 to 10 of this video series, and that is going to be the Gen 3 Razor HD, which I still maintain that the EBR9 reticle is useless without illumination at anything less than 4x. Go ahead, good luck changing my mind on that. With illumination, it definitely does help, but without it, it is piss poor. However, despite that, and despite the fact that the first Gen 3 1 to 10 that I reviewed 4 years ago or so was an optical nightmare, this one is a fairly new production model, and maybe I had a lemon the first time around. And if that's the case, I'm very embarrassed because that means that I put out a review out there that might not have been 100% honest, or at least it was honest to the scope that I had, but not overall to what the Gen 3 Razor HD 1 to 10 can be. This is a very good performance in every facet as far as focus goes, sharpness goes, and clarity goes at any magnification at almost any distance. Again, I have to say almost any distance because inside 100 yards at higher magnifications, you're going to run into focus issues. But beyond 100 yards, this is what a properly set up 1 to 10 should look like. I can absolutely see why so many people like these things. It's a razor, and razors are razor sharp. Every razor I've got in my hand on, even the Gen 1 5 to 20, was breathtakingly beautiful. But even here, at 180 yards, the image looks fantastic. Pulling it out to 8x, it only looks even better. And this is one of the things that bothers me. I really wish Vortex would come out with a 1:8 version of the scope and tweak the reticle just a little bit. It would really transform this thing into the first focal plane scope to get, but we're not there yet. From 180 yards to 300 under this thick canopy, those targets look really good at 6x. Slowly increasing the magnification though to its maximum yields again a pretty good result. The center of the image is nice and sharp, and the outside looks pretty even as well. It doesn't look like it just tapers off very quickly. That reticle though is very hard to pick up on the center. The dot and the segmented circle around the dot are a thinner layer of reflective coatings. This way you can see through it, so this way it doesn't obscure your target. The problem is it's just hard to see all the time. Sure, many people won't have an issue with this, but I myself need to point out things that some people might not realize or understand. Back to the power towers, the illumination on the Gen 3 Razor is exceptional. But again, we're going to keep it off so this way I can illustrate just how bad the rest of the reticle is. At 300 yards at 1x here, everything looks quite good. There is a little bit of shift to the outside image looking through the scope as opposed to what we see outside the body with the naked eye. But increasing the magnification to focus solely on the sharpness at the extremes of what this thing is capable of, and we have a fairly good looking image. I filmed all of these LPVOs on the same day, so there's still a tiny bit of haze to the air, but despite that, this is a fine looking image at 300 yards. Even out to 900 yards on that far solar panel, it looks pretty damn good. The mirage is pretty extreme, again, because it was a very hot day. That center part of this reticle, though, absolutely sucks. Pulling out the magnification again to 8x yields just a better looking image. And being a 1:8, it would probably have a better, more forgiving eye box and just be a better overall setup optic. But what do I know? The final thing to illustrate with the Gen 3 Razor is how tight the eye box is at 10x and what it does with the illumination. When you get slightly off center, the illumination just shuts off. This is very reminiscent of some older style first focal plane LPVOs with center bright, super bright illumination like this. I'm talking about Leupold Mark 6 1:6, where if you're perfectly behind it, it's fine, but you go even a little bit off in either direction, the illumination shuts off. I don't like this because if you're not behind it perfectly and you're trying to get behind it and look through it properly, you can't use the illumination as an aid the way you can with a second focal plane scope or even just a better developed first focal plane scope. It literally just shuts off. Another thing that happens is the image does start falling apart when you start going into the shadows. The stability on this thing isn't great, again, because we're on the cutting edge. We're on the fine line of being a little bit too much. If this was a 1:8, I could guarantee that it would perform better than how this performs. But unfortunately, horsepower sells cars, but torque wins races. I'd much rather have a torquey 1:8 than a high horsepower 1:10 any day. Moving past all of the 1:10s, let's focus on the 1:8s, and starting with the cheapest. The EP8, I think, is a pretty damn good performing optic. Sure, it's got some flaws, but overall, I think for the price point, it impresses a lot of people because it performs better than what its price point should illustrate. However, getting it out to 100 yards, you can see that the image softens up, but the reticle looks good. Like I was saying earlier, this was that fine balance between getting the rear diopter set 100% properly. It was a very delicate balancing act where even an eighth of a turn on the rear ring would change how the overall image looks dramatically. This was when I had it set up the original way, and I just wasn't overly impressed by it. Take a look at how those reeds and those trees look really close versus the farther targets. They were much more in focus than what we're looking at here, whether it be the 100-yard paper targets underneath or the 180-yard berm at the center of attention. It's at this point that I make a minor adjustment to the rear diopter. Watch the reticle go from perfectly sharp to just out of focus, yet the image itself looks much, much better. I end up finding a small in-between for the rest of the footage, but for this right here, it's a perfect illustration of what the issue I was having with this EP8. But beyond this issue, there's nothing else negative to really say about it. I did a little bit more fine tuning at 300 yards before we advanced forward, but out here, that image looks pretty damn good. I'm able to fine tune it where I felt the balance was as good as we're going to get as far as sharpness to the reticle and sharpness to the image. Once it was set here, I left it and that was it. As a result of the fine tuning of the diopter, when we come out here to the power towers, you will see that here at 1x, everything is beautifully sharp and clear from center to edge. It is wonderful. And the illumination is more than adequate, but again, not bright enough to really make use of this reticle and how poorly designed it is for fast, accurate use on that center. Increasing the magnification, we crest past that large donut at around 6x, and we are left with this reticle in the middle. I do think that I prefer how this reticle looks versus what we see in the VUDU and the Stryker at the lower magnifications, but I feel it might get a little bit simpler for a lot of people at the higher magnifications. Despite that though, that's a personal opinion. The image itself is very, very nice. Sharp, clear, bright. This is a very good performance. If Arken had opted for this to be a 1 to 10 as opposed to a 1 to 8, it would be nowhere near as nice as what it looks like out here. Even out to that 900-ish yard solar panel out in the distance, that is a very good looking performance. Focus looks like it twists a little bit at 600 yards, but beyond that, it's rather nice. The last thing to talk about with this thing is the eye box and image stability. The eye box might be very tight, but at least the image is fairly stable, and the illumination is visible all the way out to the edge of the shadows. It's quite good. For a $400 optic, you cannot ask for more than what this thing delivers. The NightForce NX8. I've criticized this thing from the get-go. The view through this thing is very small. The amount of body that we see is quite apparently massive. But optically, it's okay. It's nothing really to write home about. It functions well enough. And if you're okay with that, then I think you're going to buy a decent optic with this thing. The DMX reticle is a bit of a mixed bag. I think it would be amazing in a 2 to 12. In a 1 to 8, it works well above 2 to 3x. Below that, it really needs illumination to shine, but it's still way better than the EBR9 found in the Razor. Optically, at 100 yards at 8x, it is beautiful, however. Center sharpness is very high, edge-to-edge sharpness is also very good. At 180 yards at this berm, again, everything looks exceptionally nice. Very sharp, clear, with good amounts of contrast and decent color representation. And the 300-yard paper targets under the heavy canopy also look quite good. The illumination on this is also extremely well done at any brightness setting, at any magnification. Even out here at 1x, it looks pretty good optically, but it is a vastly small view looking through it, and the field of view is very, very narrow. If you run this in conjunction side by side with any of the other optics we've looked at, it is a huge difference between the two. Thankfully, at least when you're looking through this thing, optically, it is very good, especially at 8x. For whatever reason, it actually gets better the higher magnifications as opposed to lower magnifications. And here at 8x at 300 yards on the solar panel, that's a very, very good looking image. The good news is, even at 900 yards and beyond, the image still maintains a very high level of sharpness, with only the slightest bit of softening coming to the outside edge. The center is excellent, and that reticle really is awesome. However, I'm okay with adequate if it at least performs really good in some areas. And unfortunately, its eye box is still really small, all things considered. And the Illumination does the exact same thing that the Razor does, where it just shuts off when you're slightly off center. That is the biggest problem with having really bright illumination on an LPVO like this in the first focal plane. A lot of times when you are not perfectly behind it, it just shuts off, as opposed to many of the other illuminations that we've seen where you can see it until you can't see through the scope anymore. It's this thing's biggest weak link. The eye box on this thing is way too small for what it should be. I don't mind a smaller view looking through it as long as the image is really sharp and clear. This has that, but having a very small view looking through it, a large scope body, and a fairly tight eye box, it's not a good combination. Contrast the NX8 with the PLxC. Both of these are very small, lightweight, compact / compromised 1:8 first focal plane LPVOs, but the view looking through the PLxC is nothing short of amazing. The 1X really is probably, am I going to say it? No, I'm not going to say it yet. I'm not going to say it. But the 1X on this thing is sensational. And that reticle, what can I say? It's second only to what we find in the March. I don't remember that acronym. It's like 13 letters and numbers long. But this mil reticle is just wonderful. Increasing the magnification all the way up to 8x, and you will see that the center does stay sharp, but the outside edge is already softening up, and the illumination there on maximum, folks, is as good as it gets. I guess you really can't have everything. Focusing out to 180 yards, the center inside that donut, or the chevron, or the shoe, or the horseshoe, whatever you want to call it, is still very good, but outside that, it really softens up quickly. It's like leaving butter on the sidewalk in the middle of July. It's going to get hairy and nasty real quick. But that's at 8x. If you were to decrease the magnification to 7x, that's what it looks like. And if you go even further to about 6x, well, it looks flat out fantastic. That is why this scope pisses me off. Because from 1x to 6 or 7x, it's wow. And then 8x is like, and it doesn't stop there. Even out to 300 yards, the center is still very sharp, but look at how bad the rest of the image looks. It's so soft and just blurry. That is until you lower the magnification ever so slightly, and a lot of that gets fixed. Now see, you might be telling yourself, why not just run all of these optics at slightly lower magnifications and it would fix a lot of your problems that you have at higher magnifications? The problem is, at least on most of the 1-to-10s, inherently having a 1-to-10 is going to make your 1x probably not as good and your 10x not as good. So running it at 8x might be better, but if you had a 1-to-8 that was just better overall, it would perform better overall at every magnification. I did film the PLxC out of the power towers on a different day from everything else, which is why everything looks a little bit different. It was much more overcast, but the air was a little bit cleaner. I fooled you. I stopped at 6x before I ran it all the way up to 8x, as seen here. Again, the center looks quite good, but the outside does soften up. Again, very consistently with what we've seen throughout the rest of the video. And unfortunately, the farther out you go, the worse it gets. For some of you, you'll say, well, I only care about what I'm focusing on at the center. But what happens if you're using those drops out to like 10 or 11 mils at 1,000 yards, which is actually exactly what we'd be doing there? You're going to have a really hard time at 8x. Pulling it out to about 6x, it fixes all those problems and then some, and you are left with a tremendously good looking image. Unfortunately, the negatives don't stop there. Because this is compromised in many ways, the eye box is also extremely tight. And Mix that in with the very dim illumination, and you're going to have a hard time getting behind this thing at a higher magnification in a less than stellar environment. Last but not least, the NightForce ATACR 1-8. We have a small view looking through this, albeit not as small as the NX8, and it's actually kind of close to what we see with the VUDU. It's also very close to what we see with the March, but we have a lot more scope body present, and that throws off the proportions ever so slightly. The DMX reticle, I've already talked way too much about it, so I'm not even going to bring it up, but we're going to talk solely on optics. And at 8x here at 100 yards, this is one of the best performances we've seen all day. Even out to 180 yards, everything looks fantastic. The illumination does look like it favors one side from where the emitter is as opposed to some other options that we saw earlier, but shutting it off, and the reticle is more than usable and capable at these magnifications without illumination. I almost feel that backing the magnification out to 6x makes the image worse, which is a little bit interesting. I did find that the in-between magnifications on this was just okay, but at the extremes, the 1x and the 8x, it performed very good. But that is not a very uncommon thing with high magnified LPVOs, especially in the first focal plane. In second focal plane, it's almost not even an issue, but with first focal plane, it really does throw a giant wrench in the machine. 300 yards looks excellent though, better than what we saw at 180 yards at 8x, and that was already pretty damn good. Illumination also fills out a little bit better here because just the way the brightness settings were set, but overall, this is excellent at 8x. To the power towers with you, ATACR, I say, and we're left with something quite interesting. It actually looks like it's not focused great out at distance at 1x. It's almost as if they set the parallax on this and the focus to be a good balance between 1x and 8x at different distances. It's a little interesting how they developed that, but slowly increasing the magnification only yields that everything's going to be sharper and clearer at 300 yards when we start out, and then we'll push it out from there. You will note that the entire rear ocular housing is rotating with the magnification ring because it is a sealed one-piece unit. At 300 yards, at 8x, everything here looks great. Can't really complain about anything. And shifting our attention to the 600 and 900 yard solar panels yield basically the exact same result. The power towers at the very extreme edge are about 2,000 yards away, and they look okay, but nowhere near as good as some other options that we've looked at today. So I wonder if you were to push this thing really, really far, if it would optically be able to hang with some other options. Well, from what I can gather, looking through these wonderful little flowers, it's going to be good enough. But if you're trying to really use this thing out to 2,000 plus yards, I think it's going to be out of its league a little bit. Just like we saw with the Razor and this thing's little brother, the illumination basically shuts off like a light switch when you are not perfectly behind it. Image stability, though, with the reticle and the image itself are excellent. At 8x, this is a very nice performance, but the illumination shutting off really is just a kick in the nuts. Pulling it out to 6x, we do get a slightly better performance, but you'll also note that those flowers are more in focus than the targets out at distance are. Again, optically, this thing is just set up completely differently from every other scope that we've looked at today.
You know, I had filmed an entire segment to conclude this video, and that was done shortly after I had done all the filming and preliminary testing for all of these scopes. And I came to the conclusion after a little bit over a week of trying to compile this video, making this thing happen, that I really needed to have more time to let everything soak in. Because when you're in the heat of the moment, certain things grab at you, certain things pull you away, and you're just sort of left in limbo. You're being pulled every which way but the way you want to actually go. And I've come to the conclusion that there's no winner here. There's no single scope that outperforms everything else in any sort of way, shape, or form. All of these, all 12 of these optics that I've talked about are all different and unique in their own special way. Everything brings something different to the table, which in and of itself is amazing because think of all the options that we have out here. This is a huge market, and it's a market that is there for us. Sure, I wanted this video to be only $1,000 plus first focal plane 1 to 8 and 1 to 10 LPVOs, but then one of my supporters decided to throw the Arken at me. I was like, you know what? Let me roll it in just for the hell of it. And I have to say, I'm glad that I did, because is there a real difference between a $400 scope and a $1,200 scope optically enough that it's like, if you're focusing on just one area, like, is that enough of a reason to go with a more expensive optic? And for most of the cases, you've seen it yourself, I don't think it really is. I think what it really comes down to is what's going to best suit your needs. And this is something that I've driven home on multiple occasions. There isn't just one best overall, oh my God, this is the best scope ever. But there is going to be a scope that's going to be right for you. And I hope that this video has at least guided you in the direction towards one of these optics that is going to be best for you. What do I feel personally? Letting all my opinions out there in the world. I think 1 to 10s can be good, but they're not great. There's way too many flaws with them. Not necessarily at the minimum or the maximum magnification, but just the combination of trying to figure out a parallax that works, trying to figure out the magnification range that works, trying to figure out the field of view, the eye box, the exit pupil, all these things, trying to figure all that out and get that balancing act properly is hard. It's really hard. Sure, some scopes look like they do it very well, but there's still some things that it's hard to relay without you actually getting behind the scope yourself. The biggest thing for me between most of these 1 to 10s is either at the minimum, the maximum, or in between. The Gen 3 Razor is probably the best overall 1 to 10 that we've looked at, but in between, the image stability really isn't there. The 1X is pretty good, but there's still some distortion. The Reticle is by far the weakest link of that optic, bar none. And just the fact that the eye box is as tight as it is. If that was a 1 to 8, I think a lot of those issues would be rectified. And for that reason, and that reason alone, I don't recommend 1 to 10s. Hell, I barely even recommend 1 to 8s. However, at least the 1 to 8s seem to outperform the 1 to 10s in almost every metric without even really trying that hard. And if all the 1 to 10s were 1 to 8s, I bet this would be a much more level playing field. Would I even recommend a first focal plane 1 to 8 to somebody? Yeah, if you're looking for a simple setup. If you're planning on running an offset red dot and using that as your 1X, then no, go with an MPVO. Yeah, it'll be a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier. It might not fit the look or the motif that you're trying to do, but you're going to have a much better performing optic where it counts, which is when you're actually using it. Okay, so it's 4 or 5 ounces heavier. Big deal. But if you don't plan on running an offset red dot, if you're planning on just running an optic and you want nothing else about it, and I can completely understand that because I too like having something that's simple. One optic and that's it. If it fails, you take it off and maybe you have a backup optic or maybe you have backup iron sights, and that's fine. But in that case, if you're of that mindset, then which ones would I recommend? Well, it depends on your budget, depends on what you're looking for, right? But for me, the two real standouts actually couldn't be any more farther from one another. The first up is the PLxC. The 1X on this thing is incredible. The reticle is one of the best. Hate or love the chevron, it's very functional and usable. If you want a more precise, accurate reticle, don't buy an LPVO, buy something with better magnification and a better reticle. The only issue with this is the very wonky 8X and the very poor illumination. But if you're looking for a small, lightweight, compact 1 to 8, this does it better than most. At least it does it better than the NX8 in my opinion. The NX8 overall might have some things going for it that I really like. In fact, a lot of things I really like, but where it counts the most, actually using it, I feel like it's a step or two behind this, all things considered. The only other 1 to 8 I would recommend is the Credo, Accupower, VCOG, well, one of those three. If I had to cherry pick one, it'd probably be the Credo being the middle ground. I think for a 1 to 8 first focal plane LPVO, that thing is almost perfect. The only thing is it's heavy. It's like 7 or 8 ounces heavier than the PLxC, which is a lot of weight. But optically, that thing is beautiful. The turrets are great. It tracked very good. The reticle can use some improvements, but overall, it finds itself in between, I'd say, this thing and maybe like the DMX. I think I prefer the DMX a little bit more, even though the segmented circle on what we find with the VCOG, the Accupower, and the Credo works extremely well, all things considered. And the higher up the magnification you go, the better it gets. But as a baseline scope, I really don't think you can get much better than that, as long as you don't mind the weight. So there you have it. 2 recommendations for me from this video, both of them on either ends of the spectrum, both of them 1 to 8s. 1 to 10s aren't there. If you want more magnification, get an MPVO. I mean, my shelf is littered with different scopes, but get a 2 to 10, 2.5 to 10, a 2 to 12. There are a lot of different options that are coming out to market, which are great, but that's really it. I think right now, the maximum be-all, end-all of the first focal plane LPVO world is the 1 to 8. I don't think the 1 to 10s are there yet, but I do think in the near future, with a couple of tweaks, some of them can be really, really compelling. If you're looking for a 1 to 6 or lower, I recommend second focal plane, which is a completely different category altogether, so don't even consider that. But with all of that being said, a huge thank you to the individuals that sent in these scopes for me to have for several months to test and use and play with and just enjoy. It really was an honor to have your scope, and it was a pleasure to have them for as long as I did. And of course, a huge thank you for all of you at home watching. Without you, I wouldn't be doing this still. Thank you all very much. And as always, I'll see you again next time.
And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe Star subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.